At 37,000 feet, the aircraft trembled, alarms blared, lights flashed red, and every seasoned pilot froze. And then, a 13-year-old black girl stepped into the cockpit. Her name was Jasmine Carter, and she had no business being there, at least, not according to protocol. But as Flight 3271 hurtled toward disaster, it wasn't Captain Ray Dawson or First Officer Mark Ellis who held the key to survival. It was Jasmine. Calm, clear, and terrifyingly precise. She diagnosed a catastrophic hydraulic failure the moment she felt the unusual vibration beneath her seat in 14C. While the crew dismissed her warnings at first, the storm outside grew violent, and within minutes, their hesitation turned to desperation. Jasmine had never flown a plane, but she'd been trained in the language of aviation by her grandfather, a Tuskegee airman, and sharpened her knowledge through simulator work with her father, a systems engineer at MIT. In that cockpit, with 217 lives hanging in the balance, she became more than a passenger. She became the voice of reason. She calmly instructed the pilots to disengage the failing primary system and switch to the copligation auxiliary hydraulics, a maneuver so advanced, it stunned both men into compliance. And it worked. Against every odd, the plane stabilized. Jasmine Carter had done the unthinkable. Saved a commercial jet, with nothing but inherited wisdom, unmatched focus, and the courage to speak when it mattered most. Jasmine Carter was not an ordinary 13-year-old girl. She carried in her mind the legacy of 2 generations of aviators, and when crisis came, that legacy became her greatest weapon. Born and raised in East Charlotte, Jasmine had grown up in the modest apartment of her grandmother, Edna Carter, a retired school teacher who had raised Jasmine after her mother passed away. But it was her grandfather, Captain Wendell Carter, who had shaped the foundation of Jasmine's future. Wendell was once a military pilot who flew with the Tuskegee Airmen and later flew commercial aircraft for decades. Though retired by the time Jasmine was born, he recognized something rare in his granddaughter, a mind wired for systems, a heart steady under pressure, and a soul drawn to the sky. From the age of 6, Jasmine sat beside him every Saturday as he walked her through emergency procedures, system schematics, and flight simulators. While other kids were learning multiplication tables, Jasmine was memorizing the redundancy layout of the Boeing 767. When Wendell passed away, his teachings lived on through Jasmine's notebooks, simulator time with her father Dr. Malcolm Carter, a professor of aerospace systems at MIT, and her relentless study of aviation manuals. The knowledge wasn't just passed down, it was infused into her. Jasmine didn't just understand how planes flew. She understood why they failed. She recognized the subtle hum of trouble in the vibrations most passengers ignored, and she could decode cockpit signals by sound alone. So when the hydraulics on Flight 3271 began to fail, Jasmine's body reacted, before her brain even formed the words. She knew. In that terrifying moment, what allowed Jasmine to step into a cockpit filled with screaming alarms and frozen pilots wasn't ego or arrogance, it was preparation, and the invisible presence of those who had trained her for this moment. She didn't hesitate because her grandfather had taught her that hesitation in aviation can cost lives. She didn't scream because her father had shown her that clarity under pressure is what separates leaders from bystanders. It wasn't just Jasmine Carter who saved that flight, it was the collective wisdom of Wendell's war-hardened discipline and Malcolm's scientific mind, channeled through a girl too young to drive, yet wise enough to land a plane. In that moment, history converged. A girl often dismissed because of her age, race, and gender became the anchor of 217 lives. And when the world later asked how she did it, Jasmine's answer was simple: I just remembered what they taught me. The first time Captain Ray Dawson laid eyes on Jasmine Carter, he smiled politely, but didn't believe a word she said. After all, she was just a 13-year-old black girl with braided hair, a NASA t-shirt, and a physics book in her lap. To the outside world, Jasmine looked like any other unaccompanied minor traveling to visit her father. No one, not the flight attendants, not the passengers, and certainly not the pilots, expected her to be anything more. But when turbulence gave way to system failure and panic, Jasmine became the one voice that could make sense of the chaos. Still, that voice was met with doubt. When she first approached flight attendant Karen Ellis with warnings about a hydraulic issue, she was dismissed with a condescending smile. "You're probably just nervous about the bumps, sweetheart," Karen had said. Even after Jasmine precisely identified the pattern of a vibration as a sign of pressure loss in the primary hydraulic system. She was told to sit down. When she insisted again, Karen scoffed. How could a kid possibly know that? That doubt didn't stop Jasmine. It only made her more determined. She had grown used to people underestimating her. Teachers had done it. Peers had mocked her. Even some of her father's colleagues at MIT had spoken to her like she was invisible. But Jasmine had also grown up in a home that taught her this. You don't need permission to know what you know. So when the cockpit finally opened to her, and Captain Dawson looked at her with raised eyebrows and disbelief in his eyes, Jasmine didn't flinch. She stated the problem with clarity, offered the solution with confidence, and even when he questioned her again, "How do you know this?" she answered calmly. "Because I've studied it, and you don't have time to argue." The truth is, had Jasmine looked different, had she been a boy, older, white, or wearing a prosensé uniform, she might have been believed from the start. But the world didn't expect brilliance to come in her form. And that was the real tragedy, not just that she was doubted, but that such doubt could have cost everyone on board their lives. In the end, Captain Dawson did listen. Not because Jasmine suddenly looked different, but because the situation grew so dire that even prejudice had to make way for truth. And once he listened, everything changed. Jasmine Carter didn't just save a plane, she exposed a fault line far deeper than a failing hydraulic system. She revealed how deeply embedded assumptions can blind us to the very answers we need. Because sometimes, survival doesn't come from the most experienced hand but from the one no one thought to trust. The sky outside was tearing open. Lightning forked across the clouds, oxygen masks dropped, passengers screamed, and in the middle of it all, 3-year-old Jasmine Carter stood like a pillar of calm in a collapsing world. She had no uniform, no authority, no seat in the cockpit. But when everything went wrong on Flight 3271, Jasmine became the one person who didn't panic. While trained adults hesitated, froze, or crumbled under pressure, Jasmine rose, because she knew panic was a luxury no one could afford. Raised in Charlotte by her grandmother Edna, and mentored from childhood by her late grandfather, a former Air Force pilot, Jasmine had been taught that fear is natural, but control is learned. From the time she was 6, she had been immersed in cockpit simulators, technical manuals, and system failure protocols. Her knowledge wasn't superficial, it was practiced, earned, internalized. So when the aircraft's primary hydraulic system failed mid-flight, and the cockpit filled with alarms and confusion, Jasmine didn't scream. She listened, she observed. And when no one else could find the answer, she stepped forward, not because she was fearless, but because her preparation was louder than her fear. Standing at the cockpit doorway, gripping the frame to stay upright as the aircraft bucked in the storm, she didn't beg to be heard. She spoke with calm precision. "You're fighting the storm. Wrong system. The auxiliary hydraulics are still operational. But you have to disconnect the primary." It wasn't a guess. It was the exact solution the pilots hadn't yet seen. First Officer Mark Ellis gaped. Captain Ray Dawson stared at her as if she were an apparition. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice stayed steady as she explained override protocols, cascading failures, generator timelines terminology no child should have mastered, but she had. And even as the aircraft plummeted hundreds of feet, as emergency lights flickered and passengers whispered last prayers, Jasmine focused. She blocked out the panic, the doubt, the storm itself. She didn't try to save the plane by emotion or willpower. She used logic. She used everything she'd ever been taught. That's the power of true courage. It's not loud. It doesn't scream for attention. It walks straight into fear with quiet certainty. Because of Jasmine's composure, the pilots regained control. Because of her clarity, 217 lives were saved. And because she refused to let fear take the lead, a catastrophe became a miracle. In a world full of noise, she was the steady voice that mattered most. Jasmine Carter didn't just face the storm, she guided others through it. Captain Ray Dawson had been flying commercial jets for over 3 decades. He believed in protocols, in structure, in doing things by the book, until the day that book almost cost him 217 lives. It happened aboard Flight 3271, somewhere over the Atlantic. A severe lightning strike crippled the aircraft's primary hydraulic system. Critical systems began cascading into failure. Warning lights flashed red across the cockpit, alarms screamed, and his co-pilot, Mark Ellis, looked at him with barely concealed panic. Every checklist they had, every training, simulation they'd ever run, couldn't fix what was happening. And then, she appeared. Jasmine Carter, just 13 years old, stood in the cockpit doorway. A black girl in sneakers and a NASA t-shirt. No credentials. No uniform. No right to be there, at least not by the standards Captain Dawson had lived by his entire career. But she spoke with such calm, such command. You need to disengage the primary hydraulics. The auxiliary is still operational. You're running both systems in conflict. Ray blinked in disbelief. How do you even know that? Her answer cut through the noise. Because I've studied every 767 emergency scenario since I was 6. My grandfather taught me. He flew these birds for 20 years. It went against every rule to let her stay. The cockpit was restricted. She wasn't crew. She was a child. But something in her voice, firm, focused, undeniably informed, cut through the chaos. And in that moment, Captain Dawson made the most difficult decision of his career. He broke protocol. He let her stay. He listened. And it saved them all. Jasmine guided the pilots step by step through the manual override procedures. Her knowledge of system redundancy and emergency hydraulics was so detailed, even Mark Ellis had to ask, "Are you sure you're only 13? As the aircraft stabilized, Ray realized the truth. Had he followed the rules, had he ignored her voice, they would all be dead. It was a humbling moment, one that shattered his certainty, and forced him to confront his own unconscious bias about who gets to be heard in quote, emergency. After they landed safely in Baltimore, Dawson didn't hide behind technicalities. At the press conference, he stood beside Jasmine and said plainly, "I broke every rule I was trained to follow, but I'd do it again without hesitation. She saved us. And she taught me that sometimes, survival requires letting go of the system long enough to let the truth in." In that moment, Captain Ray Dawson stopped being just a pilot and became a leader. The landing gear groaned. The storm raged on. And in a cockpit, still trembling with tension, 13-year-old Jasmine Carter whispered one final instruction, then held her breath. Flight 3271 had been in free fall metaphorically and almost literally for nearly 40 minutes. A lightning strike had damaged the Boeing 767's hydraulic system, triggering a cascade of electrical failures. The pilots Captain Ray Dawson and First Officer Mark Ellis were trained, seasoned, and terrified. Emergency checklists weren't helping. The flight controls were sluggish. Systems were conflicting. And the closest runway was Baltimore, 30 minutes away. Then came Jasmine. She had no authority, no license, and no business being in the cockpit, except she was the only one who truly understood what was happening. With calm precision, she guided the crew through the chaos, disengaged the faulty primary hydraulic system, reroute control through the chaos, auxiliary backup, manually override key systems to stabilize the descent. Her instructions were flawless. And now, they had one final challenge, the landing. The main gear refused to deploy automatically. Without full hydraulic pressure, Captain Dawson would have to use the emergency crank, something he had trained for, but never done in real flight. Ellis struggled with the stiff manual system, until Jasmine quietly advised, "Back off a quarter turn, then try again. You're probably feeling tension from uneven release." Pressure. It worked. The gear locked into place. But the hardest part was yet to come. As the runway at Baltimore, Washington International, came into view, the entire aircraft, 217 souls braced. The cabin was silent except for sobbing and whispered prayers. Jasmine, now buckled into the cockpit's jump seat, held her grandfather's pocket watch tight in one hand, her eyes locked on the instruments. Flaps 20. Manual spoilers. Maintain glide slope, she murmured, almost like a mantra. Dawson responded with practiced hands. Despite the failing systems, his touch was steady, his instincts sharpened by experience, and now, informed by Jasmine's insight. The aircraft kissed the runway with a firm but controlled landing, reverse thrust kicking in manually, every inch of braking distance used to its last foot. They stopped. Alive. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the cheers, raw, emotional, unstoppable. Ray Dawson slumped in his seat, sweat soaking his collar. He looked back at Jasmine, still, steady, still composed, and said with quiet awe, "In 34 years of flying, I've never landed under circumstances like this. And I've never had a co-pilot like you. The emergency was over, but a legacy had begun. Jasmine Carter didn't just help land a Rhesus plane, she rewrote what it meant to be trusted, to be heard, and to save lives when it counted most. Before that flight, Jasmine Carter was just a quiet 13-year-old girl who loved airplanes. After it, she became the name that challenged an entire industry. What happened on Flight 3271 was extraordinary, but it wasn't just about saving a plane. It was about changing the way we see genius. Jasmine had no official title, no license, no uniform. She was a young black girl, flying, and alone to visit her father, armed only with a deep understanding of aviation systems passed down from her grandfather, a Tuskegee airman, and sharpened through hours of study with her MIT engineer father. Yet when the aircraft's hydraulic system failed, and trained professionals faltered, Jasmine stepped forward and saved 217 lives. Her actions weren't just brave, they were transformative. Because after the plane landed safely in Baltimore, and the world learned who had guided the SESH pilots through the crisis, something unexpected happened. People listened. Captain Ray Dawson, a man who once doubted her just for being young, black, and female, stood on national television and said, "Jasmine Carter saved us. I'd follow her into a cockpit." Again, without hesitation. His words shook the foundation of an industry where hierarchy often silences insight, and where brilliance in unfamiliar packaging is too often ignored. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an inquiry, but not to assign blame. Instead, they wanted to understand how a child could possess such advanced technical fluency. What they found wasn't magic. It was mentorship, discipline, early access, and a legacy of resilience. Soon, aviation schools and youth programs across the country began re-examining how they identified talent. Trans Airlines, the company behind Flight 3271, announced to the Jasmine Carter Scholarship, aimed at training underrepresented youth with demonstrated passion for aviation. Jasmine, now viewed as a prodigy, became a symbol for what happens when we look past assumptions and listen to the unexpected voices in the room. And Jasmine? She never asked for fame. In every interview, she reminded the world, "I just shared what I knew. The pilots flew the plane. We worked together." But whether she wanted it or not, Jasmine had become more than a passenger. She was now a symbol of inclusion, of overlooked brilliance, and of what happens when protocol gives way to possibility. Her story has since been taught in aviation schools. She speaks occasionally at youth STEM events. And each time she does, a new generation sees what's possible. Not just for themselves, but for the skies ahead. Because Jasmine Carter didn't just help land a plane. She launched a movement. At just 13 years old, Jasmine had done the unthinkable. She guided 2 seasoned pilots through a catastrophic systems failure aboard a Boeing 767, stabilizing the aircraft midair and helping ensure the safe landing of 217 people. What started as doubt, skepticism, and even a dismissal quickly transformed into astonishment, gratitude, and eventually, honor. As the plane rolled to a stop on the Baltimore runway, a hush fell over the cabin. Then cheers erupted. Passengers wept. Crew members exchanged stunned glances. And Jasmine, quietly, buckled into the jump seat, sat with her grandfather's old pocket watch clutched in her palm, eyes still focused, heart still steady. The danger had passed, but the weight of what she had done had only begun to settle in. Captain Ray Dawson, hardened by 34 years of experience, didn't hesitate. As emergency crews surrounded the plane and protocol resumed, he turned to her and said, "You saved us." But it wasn't for spectacle, it was a testament to what happens when we recognize true merit, regardless of age, background, or appearance. The recognition didn't stop there. Within days, the FAA released a statement praising Jasmine's technical knowledge and calm under pressure, calling her actions exceptional and instructive for the entire aviation community. Trans Airlines offered her a full scholarship to any flight school of her choosing. And perhaps most meaningfully, she was invited to speak at the National Aviation Safety Conference as a featured expert, not a guest. Still, Jasmine remained humble. "I didn't fly the plane," she said repeatedly. "I just shared what I'd learned from my grandfather and my dad." But for the millions who followed her story, she became something more. Proof that talent doesn't wait for permission. In the months that followed, Jasmine's wings, Captain Dawson's original badge, were framed and placed beside her grandfather's Tuskegee Airman portrait. And with each simulator hour, each page of technical reading, and each step she took towards certification, those wings became less a gift and more a prophecy. Jasmine Carter was no longer just a passenger. She was a pilot in the making, and the world finally saw it. After Flight 3271 made its emergency landing in Baltimore, the news broke slowly at first. Local stations reported a miraculous save. Passengers spoke of intense turbulence, failing systems, and the fear of death. But then came the twist no one expected. The person who helped guide the plane to safety wasn't a pilot, an engineer, or a member of the crew. It was 13-year-old Jasmine Carter, a quiet, unaccompanied black girl seated in 14C. By the next morning, headlines erupted nationwide. Teenager diagnoses hydraulic failure, mid-flight. 13-year-old black girl helps land commercial jet. Genius or guardian angel? Meet Jasmine Carter. Talk shows invited aviation experts to explain how something like this could even be possible. Internet forums lit up with debates. Was it legal? Was it safe? Was it real? But as more footage and flight crew testimony surfaced, the truth became undeniable. Jasmine Carter had saved lives, not because of instinct or luck, but because she knew exactly what she was doing. Her story shattered stereotypes and rewired how the public viewed competence, authority, and age. In a world where black girls are too often overlooked or underestimated, Jasmine's brilliance forced a reckoning. Her image braids neat, eyes focused, clutching a physics textbook was suddenly everywhere. Magazine covers, STEM advocacy ads, educational documentaries. But perhaps the most powerful image was this. Jasmine standing beside Captain Ray Dawson, the very man who initially doubted her, as he pinned his 20-year captain's wings onto her shirt before a room full of journalists. That photo became a symbol of humility, of courage, of transformation. The ripple effects were immediate. Trans Airlines created the Jasmine Carter Aviation Scholarship, offering full tuition and mentorship to underrepresented youth with a passion for flight. The FAA convened a task force on recognizing informal expertise during emergencies. Aviation schools across the country reevaluated their outreach programs, making space for voices they'd previously missed. And Jasmine? She remained grounded, literally and figuratively. She returned to school. She studied harder. She avoided the spotlight unless it meant helping others believe they too had something worth saying, even if no one believed them at first. Jasmine Carter's story wasn't just viral. It was visionary. It wasn't just about saving a plane. It was about reimagining who we listen to, and what's possible when we finally do. What started as a crisis in the sky became the seed of a revolution on the ground. After 13-year-old Jasmine Carter helped save Flight 3271 from a catastrophic systems failure, the world couldn't stop talking about her. The media called her a prodigy. Pilots called her a miracle. Scientists praised her technical mind. But Jasmine herself had a different focus, not on what she had done, but on what it could create for others. She knew the truth. She shouldn't have been the only one. Jasmine was the product of rare access, a grandfather who had flown with the Tuskegee Airmen, a father who worked at MIT, a home filled with flight simulators, manuals, and encouragement. But how many other kids, just as brilliant, never got those opportunities? How many children like her, black, young, underestimated, had never even stepped inside a cockpit? She wanted to change that. So when Trans Airlines approached her and her family with a scholarship and an offer of support, Jasmine made a bold request. Don't just help me. Help them. And they listened. Just 3 months later, Trans Airlines, partnering with the FAA, Jasmine's father Dr. Malcolm Carter, and former Captain Ray Dawson, launched the Jasmine Carter Aviation Initiative, a national program offering free early training to underrepresented youth with an overpraised interest in aviation. It provided simulator access, mentorship from real pilots, classroom materials, and full scholarships for selected candidates to continue into flight school. The program began with just 10 students. Within a year, it expanded to 50. Now, it spans across 5 states and continues to grow, turning middle schoolers into aviators, one cockpit at a time. Jasmine, still a student herself, became a mentor, visiting classrooms, leading simulator workshops, and telling her story not to impress, but to inspire. She reminded every young person she met that knowledge was power, and that their dreams were not too big, just waiting for the right runway. The next Jasmine Carter could be sitting in a classroom right now, Captain Dawson said. during the initiative's opening ceremony. The only question is, will we give them the chance to fly? For Jasmine, helping land a plane at 13 wasn't the end of the story, it was just the takeoff. Her true legacy isn't just the passengers she saved, but the doors she opened for the yes generation behind her. And in every child who steps into a simulator for the first time and whispers, "I want to fly," Jasmine's flight continues. In the days following the emergency landing of Flight 3271, the spotlight found Jasmine, whether she wanted it or not. The media labeled her the teenage aviation genius. Passengers called her their guardian angel. Aviation experts marveled at how a 13-year-old girl could calmly guide two professional pilots through a cascading systems failure. But Jasmine didn't see herself that way. She didn't want awards or praise. She didn't even want to be treated differently. "I didn't fly the plane," she told reporters. "Captain Dawson and First Officer Ellis did. I just helped them see what was going wrong." That was Jasmine's strength. Her humility matched her brilliance. Raised by her grandmother in Charlotte and mentored by her MIT engineer father and late grandfather, a former military pilot, Jasmine had grown up around flight checklists, simulator runs, and emergency procedure manuals. But she never once thought she was special. She thought she was prepared. She studied because she loved aviation. She memorized systems, not for attention, but for understanding. And when the moment came to use that knowledge, she didn't hesitate, but she also didn't boast. Even after being invited to speak at the National Aviation Safety Conference standing on stage before hundreds of professionals, journalists, and engineers, Jasmine stayed grounded. "Anyone could have done what I did," she said, "if they had the chance to learn, like I did." And that's where her humility became her mission. Jasmine knew there were thousands of kids like her, curious, capable, but never given the tools. So, she turned every moment of attention into advocacy, for access, for equity, for education. She visited schools. She wrote essays. She answered letters from young students who said, "You made me believe I could be a pilot too." Her humility wasn't false modesty, it was rooted in purpose. To Jasmine, what mattered most wasn't the past, but what she could build from it. She wore the pilot wings Captain Dawson gave her with quiet pride, not as a trophy, but as a promise that she would earn her place not just once in a crisis, but every day through discipline and determination. While the world admired her for what she had done, Jasmine focused on who she was becoming. And maybe that's the most extraordinary part of her story, not just that she saved a plane, but that she refused to let praise define her more than purpose. Jasmine didn't just wake up one day knowing how to diagnose hydraulic failures at 37,000 feet. Her knowledge didn't come from luck or chance, it was inherited, nurtured, and earned, passed down from two generations who believed that knowing how something works can one day save lives. Her grandfather, Captain Wendell Carter, had flown for decades, first as a military pilot in the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, and later as a commercial aviator. He had faced racism, doubt, and limitations at every turn. But he never let that stop him from reaching the sky. To him, flight was freedom, and passing on that freedom to his granddaughter became his most important mission after retirement. From the time Jasmine was 6 years old, Wendell sat her down at the kitchen table and daughter handed her a laminated diagram of a Boeing 767. "One day," he said, "this might matter." What began as storytelling turned into Saturday lessons. Fuel systems, electrical redundancies, weather patterns, emergency procedures. Not in a classroom, but in the living room, with flight manuals in her lap and a simulator booted up on an old computer. He didn't treat her like a child when it came to flying. He treated her like a future captain. When Wendell passed away, Jasmine was only 8. But she kept every notebook, every logbook, every bit of knowledge he'd given her. She wore his old NASA t-shirt like armor. She kept his worn pocket watch in her backpack, the one he said he carried through every flight he ever flew. It ticked not just with time, but with purpose. Her father, Dr. Malcolm Carter, continued the legacy. A systems engineer at MIT, he didn't just raise Jasmine, he mentored her. Together, they ran simulations on weekends. He pushed to her to understand not just what happened when systems failed, but why. He challenged her to think like an engineer, a scientist, and a pilot all at once. The same way his father once challenged him. So when Jasmine boarded Flight 3271, she wasn't just a passenger. She was the product of generations of preparation. That's why, when everything went wrong in the sky, her body knew something was off before her mind had fully processed it. That's why, when the pilots froze, she didn't. She had been trained by love, by legacy, by two men who saw more in her than the world ever had. When she stood in the cockpit doorway, giving precise instructions that saved 217 lives, she wasn't alone. Wendell was there. Malcolm was there. Her voice carried generations of unbroken wisdom. And later, when reporters asked how she did it, Jasmine said simply, "I remembered what they taught me." Because heroes are not just born in the moment, they're built long before it. In family living rooms. In late-night study sessions. In quiet affirmations passed between grandfather and granddaughter. Jasmine's courage was extraordinary. But her knowledge? That was generational. She didn't just honor her family's legacy that day, she became its next chapter. She had come a long way from the nervous one, 3-year-old, who once gripped her grandfather's pocket watch during a mid-air emergency. Now 16. Jasmine wore official trainee wings on her jacket and logged flight hours in real aircraft. Yet she carried herself with the same quiet humility that defined her from the beginning. While others called her a hero, Jasmine only called herself prepared. She never sought fame, but she embraced responsibility. She knew that young girls, especially those who looked like her, were watching. Every simulator run, every pre-flight checklist, every late-night study session wasn't just for her, it was for the next Jasmine Carter waiting to be seen. She mentored. She spoke at schools. She listened more than she talked. And every time someone asked, "How did you stay calm up there?" she smiled and replied, "Because my grandfather believed I could." Jasmine wasn't chasing the sky for herself anymore. She was clearing a path for others to rise. Real leadership doesn't begin when people applaud you. It begins when you use your strength to lift others. Jasmine Carter taught us that greatness isn't just about what you do in a moment of crisis. It's what you choose to build afterward. Her story reminds us that preparation, purpose, and quiet courage can ripple through generations. If Jasmine's story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been inspired by someone who used their second chance or spotlight to help others rise? We'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment. Let's honor the everyday heroes. And don't forget to subscribe for more true, powerful stories that restore your faith in formations. What's possible?